Testing.
Oh, thank you. I apologize to the speaker for having to do my own sound check. So good afternoon. On behalf of the Asian American Studies Institute, it is my distinct pleasure and my absolute honor to introduce Frank H. Wu, who is currently Chancellor and Dean of the University of California, Hastings College of Law. Chancellor Wu's talk occurs in conjunction with two facts. October is the month of Asian American Heritage Observance. I love months. And 2013 marks the 20th anniversary of the Institute and the Asian American Cultural Center, which is not only our partner in this event, but is our incontrovertible compatriot at UConn. Indeed, the work we do could not occur without the work they do. And I am eternally grateful to Angela Rolla and Sheila Kutsko for their enduring vision and commitment. If we could just round of applause for those folks. Sorry to cut off your applause there. I am likewise appreciative of Professor Roger Buckley, the founding director of the Institute. Roger, would you please stand? His forethought and farsightedness is unmatched and unparalleled. This event could not be possible without the generosity of the UConn Research Foundation, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Vice Provost for Diversity, Institute for African American Studies, Humanities Institute, El Instituto, and the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. I must admit that it is daunting to do this introduction, simply because I have spent the better part of my academic career admiring Chancellor Wu's work from afar, in fact, from another coast. It was perhaps by chance, but I would like to think it was more fate, that I was told by one of my graduate advisors at UMass to read his monograph, Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White, which provocatively and productively makes the comparative case that the Asian American experience must necessarily be considered alongside the histories of other traditionally marginalized groups. For someone who felt isolated and alienated in the Happy Valley of Amherst and Northampton, Wu's Yellow serves as both a testament and an anchor. A prolific writer and recognized public intellectual, Chancellor Wu is co-author of Race, Rights, and Reparation, Law and the Japanese American Internment, which received a major grant from the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund. And I just want to depart from script here. It is very rare to actually meet one of your academic celebrities, so thank you. Back to the script. He is writing a book on the Vincent Chin case, and his op-ed discussing the significance of the subject appeared in the New York Times on the 30th anniversary of the crime. His op-eds have likewise appeared in the Washington Post, LA Times, Huffington Post, and Chicago Tribune. He is a regular on National Public Radio and has provided commentary for Now with Bill Moyers. He has appeared as a guest, and this is what is so striking, on the Oprah Winfrey Show, Snap, O'Reilly Factor, and C-SPAN's Book Notes with Brian Lamb. Last but certainly not least, he has received numerous accolades. Most recently in 2013, he was voted the most influential dean in legal education in a poll by National Jurist magazine, and number 3 on the overall list of 25. And in 2012, the Daily Journal newspaper named him to their list of top 100 lawyers in California for his efforts to reform legal education. With that said, please help me welcome Chancellor Frank Wu to the podium.
Take your time. Good afternoon. It's truly an honor to be invited back to this campus. It is now my third time here in about 20 years. And so much has changed, but much has remained the same. I'd like to start by telling you a story. It's a story about why I do the work that I do, and it's a true story, like all of the stories that I will tell. Many of my friends who know that I sometimes give talks on the subject of race and diversity and the changing face of our nation, or who know that I've written a book or two on those subjects, they say to me, Why? Why are you obsessed? Why are you obsessed with race? And my reply to them is, I'm not obsessed. We all are. We all have race on our minds, even, or perhaps especially, when we don't realize that that's what we're thinking about. You know, it's not as if I wake up every morning and go walking down the street in San Francisco or in Washington, D.C., where I once lived, or anywhere else thinking, here I go, an Asian American. I don't think about my ancestry every waking moment of the day any more than anyone else would. No, I go about my business. I run the errands that I have to run. I think about how to spend more time with my wife and our dog, not always in that order. And as a law professor, I ponder how to write a final exam that no student can possibly answer correctly. So really, I'm no different than anyone else. But as I walk down the street, I have an encounter every now and then. It doesn't happen every day, but it happens often enough to remind me. It takes me by surprise. It goes something like this. I'll be headed down the sidewalk, minding my business, and there'll be a kid coming the other way. I don't know, 7 years old, 8 years old, a boy, just headed that way. And when he sees me, he stops, he smiles. And as soon as I realize he's staring at me, I can figure out what will happen next. I can predict it. Maybe you can too. He's going to strike a pose, you know, a karate, kung fu, martial arts pose right there on the sidewalk. He wants to challenge me to a fight, right? So he sort of howls and hisses. He kicks at the air or, you know, punches and says ching chong, something or the other, and then laughing, runs away. I know that that image, which has endured for generations, sometimes is replaced by something a little more contemporary. Maybe sometimes it's happened to me. It's a kid who suddenly breaks out doing the Gangnam Style dance, right? Thanks to that top video on YouTube. That's what he thinks of. And, you know, I could chase this kid down the sidewalk and collar him and say, you're a bigot. But I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that because he's just a kid. This is a joke, it's a prank, it's trivial, it's just a moment, it's nothing to him. He has no idea what it was like when I was his age, the trauma of childhood cruelties on the playground, of being called chink and Jap and gook, being asked, how can you see with eyes like that? Do your parents eat dogs? Are they communists? And so on and so forth. No, this is just an innocent moment. For this kid, there's no malice in his heart. This is just what he does. There's no question, though, that what he does is racial in nature. Now, why do I say that? Because as I watch him run away, I note he doesn't go up to everyone to challenge them to a kung fu match or to do the Gangnam Style dance. It's only when he sees someone who looks like me, with this color of skin, this texture of hair, this shape of eyes. It's as if even if I'm wearing a coat and tie, I must have a black belt on underneath, right? I don't blame him because as a kid, well, like any other kid, he goes to the movies, he watches TV, and if he sees someone like me on the screen for any more than 2 seconds, until very recently, it started to change a little bit, what is it after all that I'm doing? Breaking cinder blocks with my head, right? It's crouching tiger, hidden dragon, and so if I go by, he naturally will say, yo, what's up, Jackie Chan? It's just what comes to mind, because these are the images that rattle around in the back of his head, no different than yours or mine. And so it's moments like this that remind me that race matters. That's all around us, even when we're not paying any attention to it at all. And truth be told, a kid like this, well, that doesn't ruin my day. In fact, sometimes I'm tempted to catch up to someone who does these things and say, I'm offended. Not as an Asian American, I'm offended as someone with a sense of humor. If you're going to diss me, get some new material. You know, I've seen this 100 times. You're not even very good at it. And yet, that moment gives me pause because I realize that if an innocent child has these racial images in the back of his head, what does that signal? What does it tell us about all of us? What will happen if this kid grows up and doesn't interact in a meaningful way with someone of Asian descent? As a peer, as an equal, will he have different attitudes when he's interviewing someone for a job? Will you perhaps hear an accent where there isn't one? Will you think, well, this person's good at math and science, but could they possibly be a lawyer or a leader? Or will these images somehow affect decision-making for him, for us, for society as a whole? So that's why I decided to write a book. I set out to write a book to address a kid like this. What would I say that would be constructive, that would be part of dialogue? Because our diverse democracy depends on dialogue. Well, I actually began writing this book when I sat where those of you who are students sat. When I was in college, this book came out of a term paper. Oh, it's hard to believe how many years ago it was, more than 25 years ago. And I went to the library because I wanted to learn about Asian Americans and civil rights. So I went to the card catalog. That's how you can tell it was a long time ago. The students in the room have no idea what a card catalog is. Before computers and the web, to find out what was in a library, you went into this room where they had these huge wooden drawers that you'd pull out, and there'd be 3x5 cards listing every single book alphabetically by author or by title, and that would tell you where to go find the book. So I looked up Asian Americans, and there were a couple of books, 2, 3 books. The very term Asian American wasn't in use until the late 1960s. It had to be invented. My parents weren't Asian Americans. For one thing, they were born in Asia. And actually, there aren't even Asians in Asia. That probably sounds like a very strange claim. But in Asia, there isn't a sense of pan-Asian identity. No one in Asia says, I'm an Asian. They say I'm Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Filipino or Thai or Pakistani or Indian. They don't say Asian because pan-Asian identity is associated with imperialism or idealism. And so when my parents arrived, they didn't call themselves Asian American. But by the time I was in college, the term had been in use for not quite a generation, and there were a few books about Asian Americans. So I pulled them off the shelves, put them on a table to look at. Then I went and looked up race and civil rights, and there were lots of books on those subjects. There were books by liberals and conservatives, by historians and sociologists, books of every type, thick and thin, old, new. And when I pulled these books off the shelf and stacked them up and started to look through them, I was surprised because I would start to read these books, and every one of the books, it didn't matter who it was by, how they were trained, how prestigious their school was, or what the dust jacket blurb said about the book, even the ones where people said, everyone should read this book. This really will help us deal with these vexing issues. When I started to read, within the first few pages, it would turn out that even though the title of the book suggested it was about everything that there was concerning race, it was based on the latest census figures, that within a few pages the author would explain that they didn't know anything about, and therefore wouldn't talk about Asians, Hispanics, and so on. And they were focused on the black-white divide. Now, mind you, that makes perfect sense. That's the divide that has endured and defined so much of U.S. history. And I don't doubt that it's the one that properly, for most of these books, should have been the center of focus. But what puzzled me was the titles of the books and the claims that they made were grand. These were books that were supposed to be about everything. And so I looked at these books and I thought, even as a student, there's something wrong with these books. The methodology is not sound because the picture of the world that was presented here was not accurate. All I did was stroll through campus, and I could see that there were not just a few, there were an awful lot of other people of Asian descent, some of whom were 3rd, 4th, even 5th generation. There were people who were Hispanic, people of Native ancestry. There were people of mixed background. And none of these books addressed any of the concerns of any of these individuals or of any of the communities that they had formed. And so I thought, well, these books have an omission. And however we talk about public policy, whatever our own ancestry is, whatever view we have, it seems to me we should start with a picture of the world, a description that is accurate. And so that's what set me on this path, to write that book because it didn't exist. Most books were like Andrew Hacker's excellent study called Two Nations. And from the very title, Two Nations, you could tell, and he just went on and declared that in his view there were only two racial groups that were worth talking about. And so I began work on this book to make two very simple claims. Now, as a law professor, it took me 400 pages to make two very simple claims, but I'll present them to you today. The first claim is race is not literally black and white. The second claim is race is not figuratively, metaphorically, symbolically black and white. So let me talk about each of these in turn. First, the proposition that race is not literally black and white. I actually hadn't thought of this as particularly controversial, but it turned out to be. As I did my research, though, I realized that I had that conceit that many undergraduates have. I thought that every idea I ever came up with was mine, that I was the first person to ever think that thought. Well, as I researched race, I came across W.E.B. Du Bois, a giant, towering figure in American history. One of the founders of the NAACP, who edited its magazine, native of Great Barrington, Massachusetts, one of America's first race men. Here was someone who was an African American, before that term had come into use, who was a scholar of the first rank. He was a social scientist when social science was new, when it was a novel concept. He studied in Germany, earned a PhD, and he was a prolific writer. He wrote newspaper columns, he wrote books, he wrote even novels and plays. He engaged in a famous debate with Booker T. Washington about how African Americans should advance. Du Bois had this concept of the talented tenth, of those who would be an elite, who would achieve equality in every sphere, whether it was political or cultural, whether it was in their own wealth. And they, in turn, would owe responsibilities to a race that they would uplift. Booker T. Washington, in contrast, though they never actually debated, these two men never came to an auditorium like this and argued with one another, but it was characterized this way because each was writing articles. This is more than 100 years ago now. Washington was willing to acquiesce to racial separatism, and he advocated, as he said in a famous phrase, cast down your bucket where you are. He thought that the future lay in vocational training, that white and black could live side by side together like a hand and a glove, but that they didn't actually have to be equal. They didn't have to mix. So Du Bois, time will tell if ultimately he prevailed or not in that dialogue that they had. But Du Bois was such a great writer. His influence lasts to this day. In 1903, he wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk. I commend it to you. It is magisterial in these essays where he offers vignettes from his own life, blended with social science and journalism, and he talks so movingly about the dual identity, what it means to have others speak of you as the Negro problem, what it was for him, what it was like for him as a scholar who, as he said, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. This was the most erudite of people that you could possibly meet, not just in that era, but even today. And a particularly poignant passage, if you've ever written a term paper on race, if you've ever studied it at all, you likely have quoted Du Bois, because at the dawn of the 20th century, he penned these words that you likely have quoted or seen quoted. He said, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." What's interesting about his work, though, is like so many great thinkers, it's misquoted. You always hear it said exactly as I've said it, but that's not what he wrote. I haven't even given you half the words in the sentence. If you go back and read that essay, what he actually said was the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, comma, the relation of the darker to lighter races of men in Asia, Africa, and the islands of the sea. in Asia, Africa, America, and the islands of the sea. Now, what's important about this is that Du Bois simultaneously, you could not doubt his profound commitment to the African American cause, a cause of equality, a cause of overcoming Jim Crow and everything that it stood for. Yet, he also thought universally. So it turns out that this idea that I had wasn't mine at all. Du Bois had thought of it decades earlier, and in his advocacy, when you go back and take a look at it, he always blended, on the one hand, the arguments that he thought strategically would be best for African Americans, and on the other hand, a concern with global causes. He commented on world wars, he commented on labor movements, and he always put these side by side and saw how not only was there no conflict, but each cause that he stood for reinforced the other. So the proposition that I have is actually not at all new. It's just a return to something that we understood for so long, which is that race and ethnicity are complicated, that there actually are so many different combinations, and when we take a look at how we define race, we see that this color line has been imposed in a way that creates its own reality, that even as biologists talk about there being very little, if any, scientific basis for the concept of race, nonetheless, it enthralls us as a construction, as a concept that we've used artificially to divide people. So we have such rules as the one-drop rule, which actually was enshrined in law, this notion that if you had any African-American blood, you were therefore indelibly black, because the black blood tainted the white blood. Indeed, in the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson, that's the case that ushered in the black codes, that said racial segregation was constitutional, that it did not violate the equal protection of the laws. The party in that case, Homer Plessy, was, they used a term then that we would find offensive today. He was an octoroon. That is to say, he was 1/8 black, 7/8 white. And he actually, it is said, could have passed if he wanted to. That is, he could have said that he was white, and most people would not have known otherwise. Yet, because of these rules, despite his ancestry, the overwhelming majority of which was European or Caucasian in nature, he was legally and socially black. So, and that meant that he had to sit in the segregated railroad car. But even when you go back to cases like that, where there was a dissent by the first Justice Harlan, it was an 8-1 decision upholding racial segregation. Harlan wrote, our Constitution is colorblind, and that concept also entered the popular speech. It's interesting, Harlan didn't actually mean what we think of by colorblindness, or moral colorblindness, for he then went on to say, though, white race is dominant, and so I doubt not it always shall be. And so he endorsed very explicitly and clearly in his dissent the notion of white supremacy. What he meant is the law should be neutral, because if the law was neutral, it would allow whites to remain dominant. And in a fascinating, obscure, forgotten part of history, Harlan then went on to say, well, we shouldn't force Homer Plessy to ride in a black railroad car because we allow the Chinaman to ride in the white railroad car, and that's obnoxious and terrible. And Harlan had, in numerous other decisions, advocated the exclusion of the Chinese. So he was not only perfectly willing to see color when it suited him, but he wanted to draw color lines socially and use the neutrality of the law to enforce them. And then on top of all that, in these earliest cases, long before anyone started to talk about Asian Americans, there were Asian Americans present in legal history, in the mainstream history. The very fact that those of us born in the United States are citizens of the United States, this birthright that we have, comes from a case from that same era, Wong Kim Ark, a case litigated by someone of Chinese descent born in San Francisco. It isn't just the law. When you go back and you take a look, it's astonishing, this history that we've very deliberately neglected. There have been Asian immigrants in sizable numbers in this nation since the 1830s. There were actually Filipino sailors in New Orleans when the Louisiana Territory was still, hadn't even yet been purchased. So the Asian presence in the New World dates back much further than anyone realizes, even people themselves Asian Americans. If you go back and look at the roster of the Union and Confederate armies, this is astonishing. You'll find that during the Civil War, there were Chinese soldiers on both sides. And then after the Civil War, there were astonishing schemes in the Reconstruction South to import Chinese coolie laborers by the millions, the thinking went, to replace recently freed black slaves on plantations. That sounds so fantastical that you likely doubt my claim, but you can look it up. I know these days all of human knowledge is on the web and you can just Google it. But the Mississippi Chinese have descendants to this day. Those schemes failed. They did not import millions, but they did import hundreds and then a few thousand Chinese laborers in the late 1860s and 1870s into the deep South. Many of those families then intermarried so that they developed a white branch and a black branch of a family that had an Asian surname, such as Wong. So there's this fascinating history that supports a very simple proposition, which is race is literally more than black and white. And if we talk about it as if it's only black and white, we not only exclude all of these individuals, but we distort the discourse. It becomes harder to understand the Los Angeles riots after the Rodney King case was decided. It becomes harder to understand tensions and conflicts on campus. And so when we add Asian Americans, people of mixed race background, Afro-Asians, for example, we gain a richer and deeper understanding of the world around us and who we are. That leads directly to the second claim that I would make. You know, my book actually, instead of being called Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White, should have been called Gray, except the publisher would never go for that, a book called Gray. You know, my book, if you've seen, has a very bright yellow cover. That's probably why it sold well. A book with a dull, drab cover wouldn't sell well. But the second claim I have is even more important. It is that race is not figuratively, symbolically, metaphorically black and white. Let me explain what I mean by sharing what I believe is the conventional narrative, the received wisdom. The narrative that we have about race portrays it in metaphorical black and white terms. What I mean by that is there are villains and there are victims. There's the Ku Klux Klan. There are skinheads. There are Nazis. There are those who wear their hatred openly. Those who would shoot or stab or spit upon or exclude from an apartment building or restaurant or job someone who was different from them in race or gender or faith or in whom they choose to love. And those cases are egregious and clear. Then there are the victims, faceless, anonymous, people who have violence visited upon their bodies in cases that are so brutal that if we look at a photograph of a lynching, we cannot help but avert our gaze because it is too painful even to see it depicted. This is the narrative that we have. There are evil people who do wrong to people who are passive, who are not agents of their own destiny. And thank goodness we had the civil rights movement. We now see the error of our ways, of our grandparents and great-grandparents and their forebears. And we now agree that hatred and bigotry should be outlawed. Not just that, but that it is morally wrong and diversity celebrated. Now, this is a good and uplifting story, and there is truth to it. Don't get me wrong. There have been, and continue to be, egregious cases. And I'm as dedicated as anyone else to fighting those. And there are those to whom the most terrible wrongs have been done. Some have been able to seek recourse through the law, and others haven't. My concern, though, is when we frame this dialogue, when we frame this story in such stark terms, it becomes all too easy for us, those of us who lead lives where we do not go hungry at night, those of us who are fortunate to come to college, to enter a field like law, those of us who we've done well for ourselves. It becomes easy for us to say, well, I'm not a villain. I teach my children not to use the N-word. I abhor racism, bigotry, and hatred in every form. And then for us to say, and I'm not a victim either. No one need take pity on me. These incidents, they've never happened to me and likely never will. And for us then to wash our hands of the matter and shrug and say, so this is a story of the past, and we have overcome these wrongs, and therefore there isn't anything else for us to be concerned about. I'd like to suggest, though, that there is much more to this story, that actually the most vexing, difficult issue that we face today is not the open bigotry, in part because of our own success. It used to be about 2 generations ago, so let's call it 40 years ago, just after the passage of the Civil Rights Acts in 1964, when there was massive resistance all throughout the Deep South, but not just there, in the North too. People forget how vicious it was, say, in Boston, when there were physical fights over busing and who would attend what school. During that era, you could stand up as a politician and declare, as people did, segregation yesterday, segregation today, segregation forever. You could be elected to office. You could be a college professor. You could head a Fortune 500 company. You could do all of these things and be openly contemptuous of people of another racial background. The same, of course, was true with respect to gender. In fact, all you have to do is pick up a newspaper from that era, and you will see the ads for jobs. There were columns that had, and this is back when we read newspapers and they carried classified advertising, they had columns of jobs for men and columns of jobs for women. It was very clear that they were divided that way, and that was the norm. No one batted an eye at that. Well, that isn't true now. We understand, even those who would wish to express bigoted views, that it's impolitic, that it's detrimental to one's career, that you can't run for office, that you can't be a college professor, you can't lead some major company and give speeches in which you declare that you have this hatred in your heart. So what this means is everyone says the same thing. Everyone celebrates when there is a week or a month and a speaker comes in. You know, people want to go to the Lunar New Year's banquet and eat an egg roll and read their fortune out of the cookie and pose for some photos with the local Asian American group. And yet, what I would suggest is that there is nonetheless, beneath the surface, much that is going on that we should be attentive to. Because all it takes is a moment. It just takes some alcohol, an economic recession. It just takes uncontrolled anger or a mob, and suddenly those sentiments surface in the most dangerous way. Let me give you a couple of examples, some a little more humorous and then one that's a little more serious. So for Asian Americans, there's an easy way to understand this. It's the lingering assumptions that people make that you're a perpetual foreigner. Never mind that you were born here, or that your parents were born here, or even that their grandparents were born here. You know, when you're asked, where are you from? And I explain, Detroit, and people look at me funny, Detroit? No, that couldn't be. Not from the American heartland. And then they follow up quizzically, they say, no, that's not what I mean. What I mean is, where they demand, are you really from? And that follow-up question, the addition of just one word speaks volumes, for it says, I'm a liar. I can't be from Detroit. After all, just look at me. It denies me the ability, the autonomy to write the script of my own life. And when I confess China, people say, oh, yes, I thought so. And then they're happy. There's nothing more to the conversation. They need not continue it. They've placed me in their geography of race. They can sleep easy at night. Sometimes, though, this leads to, I swear these are all true examples, odd little bits of further conversation where people will say to me, you know, I just visited the Great Wall last year. As if I should say, oh yeah, did you see my cousin? He hangs out there. Or people have said to me, I had a really good meal at a Chinese restaurant last week. Yeah, thanks. I'll let the chef know when all of us Chinese folks get together again. You know, and people say, how do you like it in our country? And they want to speak very slowly to make sure I get this. Or, my, you speak English so well. To which my reply is, gee, thanks. So do you. And yet, when someone compliments me on my English, I can't very well call them a racist. They are, after all, saying something nice, right? So what I ask is instead, well, why do you ask where I'm really from? What do you think you can glean from that? What will you infer? Sometimes, though, it does turn a little ugly, right? When you point out things like this, people have said to me, well, I don't understand. Why are you complaining? Don't you appreciate everything we've given you here? As if they're the host and I'm the guest, and I've breached certain rules of racial etiquette. Or from time to time in an angry moment, right? Maybe I'm looking for a parking space and I park my car and someone thinks they should have gotten the space before and they roll down their window and shout something about, you can just go back to where you came from. Well, the answer is that's Detroit, you know? Or they display their anger in a way suddenly that strips bare the underlying sentiment. So it becomes clear that even, and most distressingly to me, people who I thought were my friends, it turns out all along, somewhere underneath, they've had this view that, well, you Asians, you're all doing so well, you're taking over. You know, I'm really worried. To which I always assure people, you know, sometimes people have said to me, people who come listen to a talk like this, who are white, they've said to me, I'm afraid my grandchildren won't be able to compete against your grandchildren. To which my reply is, yeah, don't worry about it. Your grandchildren will be my grandchildren. And they're puzzled. You're thinking about this. What does he say? And I'm not sure they're assured at all by that prospect either. But that's what I'm talking about. It's these moments where you suddenly catch yourself and you think, whoa, what just happened here? What was just revealed to me in a moment when someone didn't actually mean to say anything about race, and in fact, if I called them on it, they'd be embarrassed. Well, let me tell you a little bit of a more serious story about how all this came together for me. When I was a kid, the last thing I would have wanted to do is talk about race, you know? I just wanted to ride my bicycle around the block and fit in. That's what every kid wants. You know, no kid wants to deal with any of these issues. And I was always a little ashamed of my parents. I am myself ashamed to admit that now, but you know, my parents who did come to this country from elsewhere, so if you asked them where they were from, and well, they would have said China, because indeed that is where they're from. They ate funny smelling foods, right? My dad was always trying to get me to eat chicken feet. If we watched television, they didn't always laugh at the right time, you know? And even as a kid, I could pick up on that. On the rare occasion that they took us out to a fancy restaurant, which was almost never, because we didn't have that kind of money. But they didn't know what fork to pick up, you know, because, well, we didn't use forks at the dinner table. And so I always knew that my friends' parents wouldn't be my parents' friends. They were just somehow different. This is in the Midwest in the 1970s, when being different was not being celebrated, when you were expected to assimilate, to fit in, to be just like everyone else. No matter how hard I tried, even if I wanted exactly the same brand of jeans and sneakers as everyone else had, we didn't quite fit in. And I was angry with my parents, too. I was angry with them because when I would come home and tell them that yet again I had had some incident on the playground, well, my parents, they would scold me. They would say, you should try harder to fit in. And so I thought my parents were telling me it was my fault. I didn't know then. You know, when I was a kid, like a lot of kids, I just wanted to grow up and be like my dad, drive, shave, put on a tie, go to work. I thought my parents didn't face any of this. I thought this is just kids, you know, this kind of stuff. I didn't realize my parents faced all of this too at their workplace, and there was no one they could complain to, and they had to keep the job so that they could keep a roof over our heads and put food on the table. But they faced all of this, the sophisticated, insidious adult version of all of this. And they didn't blame me, they blamed themselves. For you see, I realized only much later that my parents always figured the reason that they were abused is because they had accents, because they were from China, because they were different. And they just assumed, my brothers and me, having been born here, not having accents, that we would just fit right in. And what I didn't know, and what they didn't know, I didn't know this because I was a kid, and they didn't know this because they were foreigners in some sense. We didn't know the language of civil rights. And my parents actually literally spoke another language. So we didn't understand that as powerful, as alluring as the American dream was, and don't get me wrong, I would much rather be here than anywhere else. And in fact, I realize from time to time my mother was right. I should have paid attention in Chinese school. I couldn't possibly make the transition my parents did, to move halfway around the world, to put down new roots, to succeed, all the while struggling to remember something of one's own past and ancestry. I couldn't make that transition now because I am, like so many others who were raised here, very much a product of American pop culture. You know, I know all the Disney characters pretty well and television theme songs from the 1970s, but I know very little Chinese or Chinese culture. I can barely write my own name in Chinese characters. And that is the course, I suppose, of coming to America and of fitting in over time. But what happened for me was this. This is the most serious part of my talk. What happened is, in 1982, not that far from where I grew up, there was an incident. It was a hate crime. Hate crime was barely in use as a term then. People had to invent that concept of hate crime. In 1982, there was a fellow named Vincent Chin. It's not someone I knew. I didn't know him, didn't know the family. He was killed. What happened is Vincent Chin, 27 years old, of Chinese ancestry, an American citizen, salt of the earth. You know, I didn't know him because we really grew up in two very different environments. He was Cantonese speaking. He came from the close-knit ethnic enclave that lived in the original Detroit Chinatown, then had dispersed a little bit. Folks who owned laundries, folks who ran restaurants, hard-working, blue-collar. Vincent's father had fought in the U.S. Army in World War II. And my parents had come later. They were Mandarin speaking. We lived in the suburbs. My dad worked at Ford Motor Company doing research. Anyway, this fellow Vincent Chin, in 1982, was about to be married. And he had not been a saint. He was sort of a hard-drinking, carousing, all-American kind of guy who liked to go out and have a good time. But he met this nice young lady, and they were due to be married. And like him, she was Chinese-American from this restaurant-owning background. And he went out with some buddies of his, Vincent did, for a bachelor's party, because that's what young American men do. On a Friday before he was to be married. It was a night that the Detroit Tigers had won a baseball game. People were celebrating, and it wasn't easy for them to celebrate. For you see, in 1982, that was the height of a recession. I know we've just come out of one, but 1982 was even worse in many ways. If you look at the headlines from the past few years, they would say things like unemployment at its worst in 30 years, which if you do the math means that it was even worse in the early 80s. Unemployment was in the double digits. In Detroit, it was twice the national average. Interest rates were in the double digits too. If you wanted to buy a house, the mortgage that you would get, some of you in this room probably recall this, the mortgages were 15 or 16%, if you can imagine. And it was especially bad in Detroit, the Motor City, because that's where American cars were made. And Japanese cars had suddenly started to succeed as never before. I know for those of you who are younger, you can't imagine a time when people didn't drive a Toyota Prius. But there was a time when you'd be made fun of if you had a Toyota, a Honda, a Subaru. People would say, what are you doing with that Jap crap? Those small cars that were fuel efficient, that were coming by the container ship load, doing so well that people talked about it as an economic Pearl Harbor, that the Japanese would succeed through automobiles in what they had failed to do during World War II, that is, conquer the United States. So Detroit in 1982 was really hurting. It was not a place or a time when people went out and had a good time, except that Chin did for this bachelor's party. Went to a seedy part of town, these buddies of his. They're having a good time, drinking, probably drinking too much, and they ran into two other gentlemen who were white, who were auto workers, a father and a stepson. They were all regular patrons of this strip club. And these two other gentlemen started to say some things. They started to use racial slurs, witnesses said. Chink, Jap, Nip. That's a slur you hardly ever hear anymore. And then one of them, according to one of the witnesses, said to Chin, it's because of you little motherfuckers, pardon the language, because of you little motherfuckers that we're out of work. Meaning that Chin, of Chinese ancestry, was thought of as Japanese, that Chin, an American citizen, was thought of as a foreigner, that he was a representative of Toyota or of Tokyo. Well, that was enough. Chin got up and went over, and suddenly people started throwing fists. They picked up chairs, were swinging them. Bouncers came over to throw everyone out. And what then happened is the father and stepson, being avid baseball fans, they just happened to have a bat in the trunk of their car. They took the bat out, came toward Chin, who started running. He and one of his friends went one way, and two other friends ran the other way. Father and stepson then looked at one of the other friends, who was Asian American, and said, let's get this fucker. And they were going after him. But all the four of them scattered and ran too fast and too far. So the father and stepson got in their car and started to drive around. And for those of you who are lawyers in the room or law students, something that the record doesn't make quite clear is how long they drove around. Could be 2 minutes, could be 20 minutes. That's important because it tells you whether there was a cooling off period, whether there was time for premeditation. But a few blocks away, they spotted Chin sometime later at a McDonald's fast food joint. The crowd had gathered because the baseball game was over. People were in a good mood for once in Detroit, 1982. And the father and stepson jumped out of their car. The stepson sort of got Chin in a bear hug or pushed him or something out into Woodward Avenue, the major thoroughfare. And then the father, using the baseball bat, took repeated swings at Chin's head and body until he had literally cracked his skull open. And with cerebral matter and spinal fluid and blood pooling onto the pavement beneath him, Chin crumpled, uttering the last words, "It's not fair." He was taken to nearby Henry Ford Hospital. He never regained consciousness. And a few days later, his family pulled the plug. The guests who would have attended his wedding went to his funeral instead. The two perpetrators, who never denied their actions, they always admitted that indeed, using a baseball bat, they had bludgeoned to death another human being, appeared in state court, sober, cleaned up, represented by counsel, and they took a plea bargain. They agreed that they had committed manslaughter, not murder, and the judge, upon hearing that this was nothing more than a bar brawl that had gotten out of hand, sentenced them to probation for 3 years and a fine of $3,000 each. That particular incident, as you might imagine, became a cause. Suddenly, people who had always been quiet and thought that they would work hard and succeed were angry and marched. No one had ever seen this before, and no one's ever seen it since. This case, in the book that I'm writing, I'll argue, gave birth to Asian American the death of this one man. Because suddenly people who didn't see themselves as having anything in common, whose ancestors would have been at war, recognized that, as we so often heard here, well, you all look alike. So Chinese and Japanese came together with Korean and Filipino and Vietnamese and Thai and you name it. People who were immigrants, people who were native born, people who were liberal and conservative, the parents and their children, despite the generational gulf, they all marched and protested. Whites and blacks joined them, labor unions, women's groups, in a campaign seeking justice for Vincent Chin. Because people didn't quite understand how it could have happened that you could kill someone in this way and not serve any prison sentence. Well, this case for me, and I just read about in the papers, I wasn't really very much involved, it explains so much that I had wanted to deny before. It explained how race mattered. It explained why teasing and taunting occurred. It explained how all of this prejudice was on a spectrum from what seems trivial, almost as if you should be able to laugh it off. You know, people sometimes say, just get over it. What's the big deal? To what is much more brutal, thanks to the recession and alcohol, the heat of the moment, whatever other factors contributed. Truth be told, I wasn't there. I don't know. I can't conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that these two killers were bigots, and indeed, I doubt that they were in a classic conventional sense. They didn't dress up in white sheets and go out that day looking for someone of Asian descent to kill. No, it was something different. It wasn't explicit and on the surface, these sentiments that they had. They had to come out over time. And so it's in this way that I suggest race is not figuratively black and white. That sometimes there's something there that you don't quite know about. The greatest irony of all here is that Chin and his killers were more or less the same. They were hard-drinking, hard-working, all-American guys with tempers who liked to hang out at the same strip club. They were the same except for race. That was the only real difference between them, that the father and stepson were Caucasian and Chin was not. So it's these issues that animate me in the work that I do, the sense that there yet remains much to be done for us to live up to our ideals. Let me close with a final story about my friends. So as I opened in thinking about friends, I have friends, as you do, who probably are like this. I have friends who say, okay, I get all that. I see why this is important to you. But then they say, but why are we still at it? Didn't we pass laws? Don't we recognize hate crime? Don't we have speakers and diversity training? We've had affirmative action. We've tried this. Some of my friends, do you have friends like this? They say, when is it over? When does it end? They're so eager to be able to say, there you go, we're done. And I always reply, I don't think we will ever be finished with this. And they shake their heads and they say, oh, you're such a pessimist. What a cynical attitude that is. You think our children and their children and their children after that will still have to deal with these same issues? And I say, well, no, they won't be exactly the same. There'll be a different face on them. The principles will remain. But I say this as an optimist, as someone who believes in the Constitution, in the civic culture that we've created in America, this city upon a hill, as it has been called, this beacon of freedom and opportunity and hope the world over. I say that diversity is like democracy itself. It's a process, not an outcome. Let me offer you the law professor's stock in trade. Let me analogize between these concepts. So think about democracy for a minute. Now I know there's the government shutdown and it's not clear that it works perfectly. I get that, but it works. The United States is a unique experiment in self-governance. And when you go to cast your ballot, whether it's this year or whether it's in 2014 or whenever it is, and it doesn't matter what party you're a member of, it doesn't matter who you'd like to see as president, this will hold true. When you go to your polling place to exercise your right, to fulfill your responsibility, to make your voice heard, to be part of this nation, if the man or woman in front of you says, "Oh, voting again? We just voted 2 years ago. How often do we have to do this? Why? When does this end? When is it over? When will we be finished with this?" You would realize, this is someone who missed an important civics class in high school. They don't get it. It would be a tragedy if it were over. The whole point of this is you roll up your sleeves and you get involved. You're engaged. That you don't stand by and watch it unfold. That you see, especially in New England, where there's a sense of the town hall, of the community meeting, where there's a belief in the power of gathering in a place and a time with your neighbors and the hurly-burly, the give and take. You won't always agree, you won't always win, but you have to show up and take part. We understand that democracy is a process. What I'd like to suggest is diversity is just the same, that it's a process. It's not an outcome. That we have to keep at it because it demands our constant engagement, and that it would be a tragedy if it were ever to cease. That for us to make good on these ideals of diversity and democracy, each and every one of us has a role to play. We write the scripts of our own lives, and then together we write a narrative for the community that we form and sustain. So I leave you with these thoughts. Race is not literally black and white. Race is not figuratively black and white. Diversity, like democracy itself, is a process, not an outcome. And it's one that I certainly believe in, and that together I hope we'll be able to celebrate and make good on. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions, and unlike in a law school class, I promise I will not say, "That's a good question, what do you think?" So it's a rare opportunity to ask a law professor a question and receive an answer. If there aren't questions, I will touch upon briefly the Fisher case. I was asked to speak about that case. This is the United States Supreme Court's decision of this past term, Fisher versus Texas. The University of Texas has been the source of many of the important cases about diversity in higher education. And this particular case is highly technical. So I'll tell you a little bit about the case, and then I'll suggest a different way to frame how we talk about affirmative action and diversity. So in the Fisher case, the court was asked to revisit the issue that it had confronted a decade earlier in the Michigan cases, Grutter and Gratz, and that it had confronted in 1978 in the famous Bakke case, Bakke versus the University of California. The question that it had to take a look at is whether affirmative action programs would be deemed constitutional, permissible for a public institution of higher education. Now, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, writing for a majority in the Grutter and Gratz cases from about a decade ago, had said that it was important for the path to leadership to be open, to be visibly open to people of all backgrounds. And in that pair of cases, she had said that race and the effort to ensure racial diversity on a campus was permissible, but it's always been clear that you can't have quotas. So holistic review of candidates, that can be done, and other methods can be used in an effort to create diversity. In the Fisher versus Texas case, the court actually resolved the case on a very technical ground. And that's actually important. I say that as a law professor to commend the study of these technical issues. The court had to consider what was the applicable standard that judges should use in reviewing these decisions by a public entity, by a public body. So it wouldn't just be true of University of Texas, it would be true of the United States Congress, it would be true of any governmental official decision maker. Now, to understand what it did, you have to back up a little bit and understand the role of the courts in our system of checks and balances. So there's a notion that the courts are the least dangerous branch or the least democratic branch because the judges, federal judges, are appointed for life. No one votes them into office or out of office. And yet they review the decisions made by Congress and the White House. So what they've done over time is they've said that if you, a citizen, or I, don't like something that a legislature has done, a statute that has been enacted, that's a bill that works its way through and is ultimately passed, that what the court will look at is there any legitimate, rational basis for the law? Now, let me explain what that means in practical terms. That means if you're angry about a law, okay, or if the governing board of UConn decides to do something, say about a football stadium or whatnot, you're angry about it, you go into court, you're going to lose. Chances are you'll lose. Why? Because the other side, the state or whatever the public decision makers, whoever they are, they can always offer some rational basis. I mean, it's very rare that a decision is totally absurd, totally without reason, right? And what the court is supposed to do is, if there's any rational basis to sustain the law, it's supposed to say, okay, you, the ordinary citizen, you lose. Now, you might look at this and say, this is terrible. It's just stacked against ordinary human being, except that's not it at all. The idea is, if you don't like a law, what are you supposed to do? Get another law, right? You are supposed to elect different people to the state legislature or to Congress or to the governor's office or to the White House or to the governing board of UConn. And that's how you change law. Or you run yourself. So the idea is to promote democracy, that the unelected judge will not arbitrarily just strike down laws he or she doesn't like, but instead respect the democratic process. So that's the way it's supposed to work with most laws. It's called rational basis. But the court has also said some categories of laws are so troubling because of the history, so vexing, so generally irrational, based on immutable characteristics that people have or that target minority groups, that they will give to these laws what's called strict scrutiny. To digress for just a moment, that test, that standard, that legal rule actually comes from a precedent involving Asian Americans. It comes from a famous case that every student studies called Korematsu. Decided in 1944, Korematsu is the case where the Supreme Court considered whether 120,000 individuals, 2/3 of them US citizens, of Japanese descent, could be locked up in internment camps because the US government thought that they were likely to be saboteurs, to be disloyal, and to rise up in favor of the Japanese empire against the United States, which, by the way, they never did. There were no instances of sabotage or espionage by anyone who was Japanese American during World War II. Anyway, that's another example of how Asian Americans, thought to be at the periphery, are actually at the center of all of these important decisions. So the test is called strict scrutiny. So any time that the government, so that could be Congress, it could be the legislature of the state, it could be the governing board of UConn, every time they make a decision where they use race or gender or a handful of other characteristics that are in the lingo called suspect classifications, then the court is supposed to flip everything around and say, okay, now instead of the ordinary citizen having to show that there's no rational basis, now the government decision maker has to show that there's both a compelling ends, a goal, and that the means, the method used to pursue that goal is as narrow as possible so it doesn't infringe upon the rights of others not included in the program. So in the Fisher case, the court actually didn't really decide anything. The court said the lower courts got it wrong. They used the incorrect standard, and so they sent the case back. They remanded it, as it's called. So that's the Fisher case. It's interesting, the other closely watched case of this past term, the pair of cases on gay rights, also involved really technical doctrines. It's not just that the court recognized that the ban on gay marriages didn't support any rational goal. In one of the cases, the case out of California on Proposition 8, the court also decided that case on a very technical basis called standing, on who was entitled to go into court to make the argument. And because the state of California chose not to defend Proposition 8, proponents of that measure had appeared in court, and the Supreme Court said you can't do that. These individuals can't make the arguments, and if there's nobody making the arguments on the other side, Proposition 8 has to fail. So those are some of the recent cases. If you're interested in these issues, I would commend to you the study of law. I know that and that's not a sales pitch, I know the study of law has come under much doubt lately. People have asked, well, should I go to law school? Is it worth it? Is there a return on investment? And before taking questions, let me offer this other thought. And I know it's in my self-interest to say this because I am, after all, a law school dean. And if you read what the angry bloggers have to say, I don't think there are any bloggers who aren't angry. These angry bloggers would characterize, I know we have at least one other law school dean here in the room, they characterize law school deans as nothing more than con artists trying to entice young people to ruin their lives. You know, I want to offer a contrary view. Everything in America depends on the rule of law. It all depends on rule of law. Enforcement of contracts, protection of civil rights. The fact that the United States is able to thrive and prosper, even with a government shutdown, it has to do with a healthy respect on the part of all of us for rule of law. That's why people aren't running wild in the streets. Think about China. When people in China make money, and people in China are making a lot of money right now, the economy of China is growing and has been for the past few years at a much faster pace than here in the US. And it's projected to continue doing that for some time. When people in China get any money at all, you know what they want to do with their money? Get it out of China. They want to put it in the United States. They want to buy stocks, bonds, real estate. They want to buy something in America. I'm not just talking about rich people. I'm talking about people who earn just a little bit of money in China. They want to get it out of China. Why? They don't have a rule of law in China. It's wild and crazy. You can sign contracts and not have any sense that you can enforce it. So the money is flowing here to the US because we've built a system that says to the world, we have rules here. It doesn't matter how well connected you are, you still have to follow those rules. And that's for the best for all of us. And it allows this economy to continue to thrive and to welcome people from different backgrounds. Because wherever you're from, you have to agree to a certain set of principles once you come here. And in exchange, you get to participate in how those rules are written. And I actually think that's a great system. So rule of law is in the background of everything that I've talked about. This sense that not just dead old rules from archaic cases, but a living set of rules that we get to help shape, that we are empowered as citizens, ordinary citizens, to determine how we will be governed. That hasn't been true anywhere else, really, in human history for any sustained period of time. That's the unique experiment and experience of the United States. And it ultimately, in some small way, is what drew all of us, or our ancestors, from other shores to this place. Questions? We have a few minutes for questions. Yes? Thank you. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. The question is, how do Asian Americans fit into this? Are they minorities, or should they belong in affirmative action programs? Is that the question?
Yeah, I mean, I have strong opinions about that, but I would love to hear your response to it.
I'll give you 3 responses. All right. So the first is just a reflection on the color line and how the color line works. Compare and contrast Keanu Reeves and Tiger Woods. Okay? Keanu Reeves, star of such movies as The Matrix and Point Break, the best Zen surfer heist movie ever made. If any of you remember that movie. Unless you're a real fan of wooden acting, you would not know that Keanu Reeves is half Asian, right? Because Keanu Reeves, throughout a career of blockbusters, beginning with Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, popular on college campuses. As a law school dean, I have to condemn the movie because it is a stoner movie. But in that movie, where he had his breakout role, he plays a dim-witted California Valley guy. So he's not just a white guy, he's a stereotypical white guy, right? You couldn't be more of a white guy than Keanu Reeves, except he's half Asian, right? So what's interesting is nobody thinks of Keanu Reeves as, hey, that Asian actor, right? They think of him as the guy with the blank stare, you know, who's quintessentially a Californian. All right. Then we have Tiger Woods. So Tiger Woods is probably the most famous person of multiple backgrounds, right? Maybe after the president. All right. So Tiger Woods is a phenomenon, right? He's so famous. Both Tiger Woods and Keanu Reeves are so famous they just have one name, right? That's how you know you've really achieved global fame, right? Tiger. All right. So he enters the scene in the mid-1990s. Now, I realize this example may be a little dated for some of you because Tiger Woods has always been famous to you, right? Well, there was a time when he wasn't famous. He was just this great amateur college golfer. Then he won the Masters, okay? And he was such a phenomenon. So he went on Oprah Winfrey and talked about he was a Kablan Asian, right? He made up that word, Caucasian, black, Asian. And there was this weird, unseemly squabble after he became famous with different groups trying to claim him, right? So Black said, he's one of us. His dad talks about playing segregated golf courses in the South. His father, Earl Woods, was a U.S. soldier. And then Asians said, well, but mathematically, he's more Asian than anything else, right? They make this really geeky, stereotypical argument. He's a Buddhist. He once played for the Thai national team, and sort of from the eyes up, he looks Asian. People actually said these things, right? Because Tiger Woods' mother was Eurasian. She was, I believe, Indonesian and Dutch. Now, this gets resolved by a competitor of his named Fuzzy Zoeller. You may recall. So he wins the Masters, and what happens, there's this ritual, right? Golf is full of rituals for the Masters. There's the green jacket and so on. And all the competitors sit down for a dinner. That's part of what they do. And the person who's the winner, who's the champion, gets to choose the dinner menu. Okay? Fuzzy Zoeller, who's a gentleman, he's a Southern gentleman. He's probably twice the age of Tiger Woods, because Tiger Woods is the youngest winner ever. He's this upstart, right? Fuzzy Zoeller is asked by some camera crew that's filming, oh, what's your view of this kid, Tiger Woods? And Fuzzy Zoeller, knowing that they're going to sit down for this dinner, okay, where they're all going to break bread together, says, well, you tell that boy. Now, there's the first troubling aspect. Did Fuzzy Zoeller mean young man, much younger than him, or did he mean boy the way that lots of Southern gentlemen used to refer to African Americans, regardless of age or stature? He says, you tell that boy not to serve fried chicken and collard greens at dinner. So he picked a really black image, right? He didn't say, you tell that boy not to serve curry chicken and lemongrass soup, right? Which he could have done, because that would be a Thai way of serving those dishes, right? So Keanu Reeves, who's half Asian, is white, and Tiger Woods, who's more Asian than he is anything else, is black. How did that happen? So that's a question. I don't have a thesis other than to say that when you add people who are neither black nor white into this discussion, it reveals the color line and reveals the complexity of it. So that's my first answer. My second answer is that actually what we don't ever really talk about is how many people are of mixed backgrounds. So Keanu Reeves and Tiger Woods are not unique. The total Asian American population in the US is something on the order of 4.8%, something like that, slightly less than 5%. But if you add in the people who are Asian and something else, that's almost a whole nother percent. Now 1% doesn't sound like a lot, except the US population is north of 300 million. So you're talking 3 million people, right, are of mixed ancestry in some way that's generally obscured and not known to people. So somebody someday should write a book. This is on my list of projects I'll never get to because I'm busy running law school. But somebody someday should write a book about Afro-Asians, for example, or Blasians, as they're sometimes called, because there's this whole fascinating history that no one has ever documented that's unfolding all around us. All right, the third answer to your question is the most straightforward answer. There's a controversy. Sometimes people say to Asian Americans, oh, well, you know, you should oppose any affirmative action program. It's going to hurt you more than it's going to hurt anyone else. Actually, that's not true at all. If you look at the, how affirmative action plays out, and if you look at test scores and grades, not that they mean everything, but they mean something, and that's how people usually are looked at when they want to come to college or law school or so on. What's interesting is, in many of the cases, on many of the campuses where there's controversy, you know what's actually happening now? And people have actually talked about this and documented, and some people are proponents of it. Affirmative action for whites. What I mean by that is if you look at the instances where Asian Americans appear to be disadvantaged, the group that they're contending with, who typically has lower grades and test scores, are not African Americans, it's whites. I mean, if you add up what group accounts for the most. So I've actually thought of writing a pair of articles someday, just to be provocative. One article would be entitled, or maybe this would be a letter or blog, would be entitled, "To Asian Americans Who Are Mad About Affirmative Action." And it would just have one or two sentences. It would say, it's not the blacks, dummy, it's the whites. That's who the affirmative action is for that's hurting it. Then I'd write a companion piece that would be entitled, "To My White Friends About Why Your Kids Can't Get Into the College You Went To." And that would have just one sentence. It's the Asians, stupid. You know, because if you look at it, and actually this is all based on empirical data. If you actually look at it, because a lot of people are angry. They say, why can't my kid get into X school? Well, if you look at the demographic change over, let's say, about 40 years, three things have happened in higher education that totally dwarf any effect that Abigail Fisher would be concerned about, Fisher versus Texas. Number one, a much higher proportion of the US population goes to college, period. And that's a good thing. Now, what does that have to do with anything? That just means the competition's that much stiffer. The proportion of young people in college is not quite, but is approaching twice what it was 40 years ago. We should be celebrating that. But it means that it's going to be approximately twice as hard to get into elite institutions, because while there are somewhat more seats than there were, there aren't as many, the growth of the elite seats at the most prestigious institutions has not gone up as fast as the growth of the population that wants those seats. That's number one. Just a higher proportion of the population is going. Number two, women. Compared to 40 years ago, the rate at which women pursue higher education is just an order of magnitude greater. And third, it's the number of Asian Americans. The number of Asian Americans, even when I was in college, and I'm not that old, you know, even when I was in college, is nothing like what it is now. You know, when I was in law school, so I started law school 25 years ago. My law school class had 400 people in it. There were 6 Asian Americans. So you can do the math, that's 1.5%. Now, at that same law school, it's well over 10 times as many. So in 25 years, you've not seen a doubling, not a tripling, not a quintupling. You've seen a 10-fold rise. So all these phenomena just point to demographic change. And most of that is positive. We're out of time, so I'll offer one last thought. It is this. Within our lifetimes, those of us in this room, we will undergo a transformation never before made by any human society on the face of the globe in history, peacefully, much less successfully. We will cease to have a single identifiable racial majority. It's already happening. The question is, what will we do? Nobody has ever done this before, but we're doing it. And we're doing it whether people like it or not. It's just happening. It's happening in places like this, on college campuses. It's happening because people mix and mingle and they form new bonds that would not have existed in the nations from which our ancestors have come. It could not possibly. I see that as cause to celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Wu. I don't know, he's the first person that ever made anything legal sound sensible to me. Thank you so much. We'd like to invite you all up to the Asian American Cultural Center up on the 4th floor, room 428. We're having a reception. I'm sure you would all like a chance to speak to him on one-on-one. I'm sure you have questions, so please join us up at the Asian American Cultural Center. Thank you very much.